In the dead of night, within the concrete walls of a notorious California prison, two men would lose their lives in an unforgiving act of violence. Jonathan Watson, already serving a life sentence for murder, would become the executioner for two child molesters, striking them down in cold blood. But was it revenge, or a failure of the system that led to this bloody reckoning? What drove a man to take the law into his own hands? A warning ignored, a fury unleashed. And a prison that couldn't prevent it. The clock was ticking, and the tension was palpable as the events unfolded in a way that no one saw coming. In the next few minutes, we'll uncover the shocking truth behind a brutal double murder, the failings of the prison system, and the blood-soaked consequences of a system that couldn't contain a man's rage. Stay with us. The truth will shock you, and the twists will leave you questioning everything. January 16, 2023, was supposed to be just another day in Corcoran State Prison. But what happened in that moment will forever be etched in the prison's dark history. Two men, both convicted of heinous crimes against children, would lose their lives in a brutal and merciless attack. The killer? Jonathan Watson, a man already serving a life sentence for murder, who would become the executioner this day. But why? What led to Watson's shocking actions? Was it an act of justice, revenge, or something far more complicated? To understand what drove Watson to this point, we must first look at who he is, and who the victims were. Jonathan Watson was no stranger to violence. At the age of 41, he was already serving a life sentence for a brutal murder he committed back in 2009. A man hardened by the criminal system, living out his days in California's notorious Corcoran State Prison. His life had been a series of violent decisions, but nothing could have prepared him, or the prison system, for what would unfold next. Watson had been moved to a lower security dormitory, a decision that would have dire consequences. He had been removed from a single-person cell, a place where he had been confined for years, and placed into a pod with other inmates, including those who had committed some of the most vile crimes imaginable. It was here, in this dormitory, that Watson would come into contact with two men whose crimes were as heinous as his own. But unlike Watson, these two men were known for crimes against children, crimes that shook the very fabric of society. David Bobb, 48, and Graham DeLuise Conti, 62, were both serving life sentences for aggravated sexual assault of minors. Bobb had been convicted for crimes that had destroyed the lives of young children, while DeLuise Conti's history was similarly horrific. The two men were among the most despised in the prison system, considered to be among the lowest of the low by many of the other inmates. Despite the grotesque nature of their crimes, the question lingers: were these two men deserving of what happened to them? Their deaths would raise more questions than answers. Watson's reasons for killing them would be revealed only after the horrific act, and through a series of letters he sent out, confessing to the killings. But what led to this violent act? Was Watson truly seeking vengeance for their past crimes, or was there more to his actions than we can see on the surface? The answer lies in the days leading up to the murders. Watson had been increasingly agitated by the presence of Bobb and DeLuise Conti in the pod. As the days passed, Watson grew restless, his mind consumed by the actions of those around him. And it was during these days that something inside him began to snap. On the day of the attack, something broke. Watson's fuse had burned down, and there was no turning back. The prison would become the site of two brutal murders, deaths that would shake the entire facility to its core. But was this act of violence really about revenge? Or was Watson's anger rooted in something deeper? Something that the prison system failed to see? Was Watson justified in taking matters into his own hands? Or had he been pushed to the brink by a system that failed to protect him, and those around him? What happened next would shock everyone in the prison. With a cane in hand, Watson attacked. The first victim, David Bobb, was beaten to death almost immediately. His body was left in a crumpled heap, lifeless on the floor. Graham DeLuise Conti was struck as well, but he lingered on for 3 more days before he, too, succumbed to his injuries. The brutality of the killing sent shockwaves throughout the prison. The act was violent, ruthless, and without remorse. Watson's reasoning, as he would later explain in his letters, was that he had no choice. He believed that the presence of Bob and Luis Conti in the same pod, especially their disturbing behavior, left him with no other option. But did Watson truly have no other option? Or was this something far more personal, a reflection of his own anger, frustration, and isolation within the walls of a system that had long since abandoned him? As we continue to unfold the details of what led to these deaths, the story takes an even darker turn. Was Watson's rage justified, or was it a deadly consequence of years of neglect, isolation, and unchecked violence? Stay with us, as we dig deeper into the prison system's role in this tragic event. Days before the murders, Watson had begun voicing his concerns about the new dormitory pod where he had been moved. He had been removed from the relative solitude of a single-person cell and thrust into an environment with dozens of other inmates. The adjustment was not just uncomfortable, it was unbearable. Watson's new cellmate. A convicted child molester. But that was only the beginning. Watson's new cellmate, along with other inmates, began watching children's television shows. To most, it may have seemed innocuous. But to Watson, the sight of these men, already convicted of such vile crimes, casually mocking the innocents they had destroyed, was too much to bear. The behavior felt like a taunt, a challenge to his sense of morality and justice. Watson was no stranger to anger. In fact, his entire life had been shaped by it. But what was happening now was something far more unsettling, a constant simmering rage that he could no longer ignore. His instincts were screaming at him. His psychological state was deteriorating by the hour. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't escape the dark thoughts that plagued him. Watson knew the situation wasn't going to resolve itself peacefully. Something had to be done. Each day, the anger built, intensifying like a pressure cooker with no way to release the steam. The disturbing behavior of the child molesters, watching cartoons, taunting the other inmates, left Watson feeling trapped, helpless, and increasingly volatile. Watson's mind was spiraling, and on the morning of January 16, 2023, he took what would become his final step toward the unspeakable act that would follow. He approached a counselor, one of the few people in the facility who could have made a difference. Watson told the counselor, in no uncertain terms, that he needed to be moved back to a higher security facility before things escalated further. But the counselor, dismissive and unconcerned, brushed him off. Watson's warning was ignored. He had voiced his fears, and they had fallen on deaf ears. This dismissal, this failure to act, would prove to be a catastrophic mistake. A mistake that would set in motion the brutal deaths that were about to unfold. In the hours that followed, Watson's agitation only grew. He could feel the tension building inside him, like a storm waiting to burst. He packed his belongings, though no one could have known then that his actions were signaling something much darker. Watson was preparing for something. Something that no one in the prison would be able to stop. In those final moments before the attack, Watson's mind was consumed with a sense of inevitability. He felt like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, with nothing but the abyss staring back at him. He knew what he had to do, but at the same time, he hated himself for it. This wasn't just about the child molesters. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about survival, about regaining control in a system that had stripped him of it, again and again. Watson knew, on some level, that he would never be able to walk away from this. That once the first blow was struck, there would be no turning back. But the world around him had given him no choice. He was a man pushed to the brink, trapped in a system that neither understood nor cared about his suffering. The counselors, the guards, they had failed him. With each passing minute, the inevitable grew closer. Watson's thoughts were no longer clouded by confusion or hesitation. His mind was a razor-sharp focus, and there was only one thing left to do. Take action before it was too late. Before someone else, someone more dangerous, took the law into their own hands. This was his moment. And he wasn't about to let it slip away. The prison was about to become a battleground. And Jonathan Watson, having been pushed too far, would soon take the only action that he believed could restore some sense of order to his world. But just hours later, the violence would begin. What happened next would set off a chain of events that would echo through the prison walls for months to come. The question remains, was Watson justified in his actions, or was he simply a man consumed by anger, looking for a way out of a system that failed him? The moment had arrived. The prison, which had been seething with tension for days, was about to erupt in violence. At approximately 2 p.m. on January 16, Jonathan Watson made his move. Armed with an inmate's cane, he walked into the dormitory with one goal in mind: revenge. What happened next was swift, brutal, and chilling. Bob would not survive the attack, dying almost instantly. But de Luis Conti? He would cling to life for 3 more days, the brutal assault leaving him barely able to fight for survival. The attack itself was calculated, savage, and cold-blooded. Watson did not hesitate. He was determined, driven by the pent-up rage he had carried for so long. Using the cane, a weapon that seemed almost symbolic, he struck the men repeatedly, targeting their heads with devastating force. David Bob, 48, was struck first. He didn't stand a chance. The violence was immediate and merciless, and he was killed almost instantly. His body slumped to the ground, lifeless. But Graham de Luis Conti, 62, had a different fate. Though gravely injured, he was still alive. The attack left him barely conscious, his body hanging on to life for 3 more agonizing days before he succumbed to his injuries. Though both victims were notorious criminals, their deaths left the prison in turmoil. The reaction among the other inmates was mixed. Some saw Watson's actions as a form of justice. A man who had taken matters into his own hands, ridding the world, and the prison, of 2 child molesters. Others, however, saw it as an act of murder. A cold-blooded killing that could not be justified, no matter the crime of the victims. In the aftermath of the killings, the prison was a powder keg waiting to explode. Guards and staff scrambled to secure the area, but the damage had already been done. The prison's sense of order had been shattered, and the question on everyone's lips was whether Watson had truly done the right thing. The emotional depth of the situation cannot be overlooked. Though Bob and de Luis Conti were convicted of horrific crimes, their deaths still left a void. They were men, however despised, with families and histories that now, like their lives, would be reduced to a tragedy. For Watson, the consequences of his actions were just beginning to unfold. But the real tragedy wasn't just in the violence, it was in the system that allowed this to happen. Watson's violent outburst didn't happen in a vacuum. It was the culmination of months of tension, isolation, and unchecked frustration. And the prison staff? The failure to act on Watson's warning days before the attack now seemed like a catastrophic oversight. The investigation into the killings began almost immediately, but the prison was left reeling. The staff, who had witnessed countless conflicts over the years, were shaken. They had failed to heed a warning that could have prevented the violence. The counselor who dismissed Watson's concerns was now under scrutiny, as was the decision to place Watson in a lower security pod in the first place. Would the prison system take responsibility for what happened? Or would they continue to bury their mistakes? As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that there was more to the story than just a man snapping under pressure. Experts began to argue that Watson's actions, though driven by a sense of justice, revealed a much darker side of life within the prison system. It was not just the anger of one man. It was a failure of the system itself, a system that allowed frustrations to fester without intervention. Prison expert and criminologist Dr. James Walker argued that while Watson may have been driven by a twisted sense of justice, the way he handled the situation revealed much more about the environment inside the prison. The culture of neglect, the lack of real mental health support, and the failure to address inmates' warnings create a ticking time bomb, Walker explained. What Watson did wasn't just about him. It's a reflection of a much larger issue within our penal system. The prison system failed Watson long before that fatal day in January. His transfer to the lower security pod, the failure to act on his warning, the absence of effective support systems, all these factors contributed to the outcome. Was it any surprise that a man, already struggling with anger and violence, would take matters into his own hands? As the investigation continued, the fallout was just beginning. Watson's actions were being scrutinized, but so was the prison system that had allowed such tensions to fester unchecked. The question that hung in the air was whether anyone in the system would be held accountable for the mistakes that led to the tragic deaths of David Bobb and Graham DeLuise Conti. The investigation was far from over. But one thing was clear: the violence that erupted in Corcoran was more than just the result of a man's rage. It was a direct consequence of a broken system that had failed to prevent it. As the story continues to unfold, we will examine how the prison system's failures ripple out, impacting not only Watson's life but the lives of those around him. Was the system responsible for creating the conditions that led to this massacre? Or was Watson simply a man who chose violence as his only way out? Stay with us as we dive deeper into the consequences of this tragedy. Days after the violence that shook Corcoran State Prison, a shocking revelation emerged from within the prison walls. Jonathan Watson, the man who had brutally attacked and killed 2 convicted child molesters, confessed in a letter. But this wasn't just any confession, it was a plea for understanding. In his own words, Watson revealed the torment he had been living with, and the feeling of helplessness that led him to commit the unthinkable. What did Watson say in this letter? What were the final thoughts of a man who had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed? In the letter, Watson poured out his soul. He described, in painful detail, the emotional and psychological toll the prison system had taken on him. He spoke about his increasing frustration with the system that failed to protect him from the worst of the worst, and failed to address the warning signs that his anger was building. "I tried to get help," he wrote. "I warned them. But they wouldn't listen. I had no choice." Watson's words were raw, filled with a pain that could not be ignored. In his confession, he described the deep isolation he felt, trapped in a system that saw him as nothing more than another inmate, another statistic. His pleas for a transfer, his request for help, had been dismissed. No one had listened. But the confession was not just about the killings. It was about a man who felt betrayed by the very system that was supposed to offer him a chance at rehabilitation. It was a man who had tried, and failed, to keep his sanity in a place designed to break him. Watson's confession wasn't merely a recounting of the violent act that took 2 lives, it was his last attempt to make sense of the chaos that had consumed him. The deeper you read, the more you realize that Watson's actions were not those of a cold-blooded murderer, but of a man driven to his breaking point. He explained how he had been pushed to the edge, how the behavior of the other inmates, particularly those who had committed unspeakable crimes, left him feeling trapped. Watson believed he was the only one who could restore any sense of justice, at least, that's how he saw it. The emotional weight of Watson's confession is not lost on anyone who reads it. He described a feeling of total helplessness. He had reached out for help, but the system he had tried to rely on had failed him. In his words, he was no longer a man with choices, he was an animal in a cage, forced to make a decision for survival. "They wanted me to be their punching bag," he wrote. "But I wasn't going to take it anymore." As the investigation into the killings continued, this letter added another layer of complexity to the case. Was Watson really justified in his actions, or was he simply a man who let his anger consume him? Was he a vigilante, seeking justice in a system that had failed him, or was he just another inmate, driven by violence and rage? The letter sparked debates that stretched far beyond the prison walls. Experts, psychologists, and criminologists debated whether Watson's actions were driven by a legitimate sense of justice or by the deep-seated anger he had carried for years. Could he be seen as a victim of a broken system? Or was this the culmination of a man who had become consumed by the very rage that had defined his life? As the details of Watson's confession came to light, the question still lingered: was Watson justified in his actions, or was this just another example of a man losing control under the strain of prison life? Was he a vigilante seeking to right the wrongs of the world, or was he simply another casualty of a system that had pushed him too far? Stay with us as we continue to explore the aftermath of this confession and the consequences that followed. Was Watson's plea for understanding enough to change the way we view the prison system? Or was it simply too little, too late? Jonathan Watson's violent actions leave us with more questions than answers. On the one hand, we have the brutal killings of David Bobb and Graham DeLuise Conti, men whose crimes were so heinous that their deaths might seem like a twisted form of justice. But on the other hand, we have Watson himself, an inmate who had been failed by the very system meant to protect him. Let's recap what we know. Jonathan Watson, serving a life sentence for murder, was moved to a lower security dormitory pod at Corcoran State Prison, where he found himself in the company of some of the most despised criminals. Among them were David Bobb and Graham DeLuise Conti, both convicted of child sexual assault. The presence of these men, their behavior, and the failure of the prison system to address Watson's concerns created a perfect storm of rage and frustration. When Watson warned prison staff that his anger was reaching a boiling point, his pleas were ignored. He tried to protect himself, tried to get transferred to a higher security facility, but the system failed him. And on January 16, 2023, that failure led to bloodshed. Watson killed Bobb instantly, and DeLuise Conti lingered for 3 days before succumbing to his injuries. The violence was brutal, cold, and merciless. But was Watson's rage justified? Or did he simply cross the line into murder? The truth is, the system failed him, and that failure led to these fatal consequences. What do you think? Was Watson right to take the lives of 2 men who had committed heinous crimes, or was this simply a case of murder, driven by unchecked rage and frustration? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear your opinion on this complex case, and what you believe the prison system could have done differently to prevent such a tragedy. For more true crime stories, real-life investigations, and deep dives into the failures of the justice system, don't forget to subscribe and click the bell for notifications. Stay tuned, as we continue to explore the darkest corners of crime and punishment.